For most of history, the power of a king wasn't measured only by how vast his empire was or how grand his palaces looked. It was measured by how deeply his enemies feared him. Because in the ancient world, war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought in the imagination, in the stories whispered by soldiers at night, in the rumors traders carried across deserts, and in the nightmares of anyone who even considered betraying a ruler. And that is why many kings throughout history developed punishments that were not only brutal, but symbolic. They weren't just about hurting someone, they were designed to humiliate, to dominate, to make an example so unforgettable that no one else would dare to rebel again. This is the story of those rulers, the kings who crafted punishments so terrifying, so psychologically devastating, that they became legends long after the kings themselves died. Our journey begins thousands of years ago, in the courts of rulers whose names today survive mostly through fragments of stone tablets and traveler accounts. These rulers lived in a world where justice wasn't a system, it was an extension of their personality. If the king was merciful, punishments were light. But if the king was paranoid, insecure, or obsessed with domination, the punishments created under his rule reflected that darkness. In the ancient Near East, for example, kings believed that public discipline was a tool of statecraft, but what separated the harsh from the horrifying was the intention behind it. Some rulers wanted obedience, others wanted fear, and then there were those who wanted complete psychological destruction. The type of punishment that not only ended a person's life, but also destroyed their dignity, legacy, and sometimes even their memory. This mindset shows up in many civilizations, from Mesopotamia to India, from China to Europe. And although the methods changed, the purpose stayed the same, to show that the king had absolute control over the bodies and reputations of his enemies. One thing many people don't realize is that ancient punishments were rarely improvised. Kings didn't wake up and randomly announce new methods. They hired specialists, philosophers, executioners, priests, architects, to design punishments that fit the crime, fit the message, and fit the king's identity. So when you see extreme historical practices, they weren't accidents, they were engineered. And in some cases, these punishments weren't meant to be physically painful as much as psychologically humiliating. Rulers understood that shame could be more powerful than pain. A man whose body suffered could still die a martyr, but a man whose dignity was stripped away would be remembered only for his disgrace. That was the goal. Some of the earliest records come from the Assyrian Empire, a civilization famous for turning fear into a foreign policy. Their kings carved detailed images on palace walls, showing how they dealt with rebels. But the goal wasn't simply execution. The goal was to erase the person's honor. When Assyrian kings captured foreign princes, they didn't always kill them. Instead, they forced them into humiliating public roles, pulling chariots like animals, sweeping palace floors, or parading through cities in ridiculous costumes. It wasn't just to punish the prince, it was to send a message to his people. Your royal blood means nothing here. Your status, your pride, your lineage, all of it is worthless before our king. The punishment was psychological and symbolic. To break one man was to break the spirit of an entire nation. Similar strategies appeared in ancient China. Many Chinese emperors believed that punishment should reflect cosmic justice. But some emperors twisted that philosophy into something far darker. Instead of simply removing an enemy, they engineered humiliations meant to haunt the punished person's family for generations. One emperor forced captured rebels to march through their own hometowns, wearing placards describing their crimes, ensuring that their social reputation died before their body ever did. Another ruler invented symbolic punishments involving masks, props, and staged theater-like performances designed to turn the condemned person into a spectacle, a living reminder of the king's control over every aspect of their existence. And in India, several medieval rulers left behind descriptions of ceremonial humiliation that weren't physically violent, but were psychologically devastating. Enemies were sometimes paraded before their former soldiers, forced to praise the king who defeated them, or made to publicly renounce their titles and honors. The punishment wasn't the suffering, it was the shame of losing everything that once defined them. Kings understood that stripping a person of dignity was often more effective than ending their life. A dead man can become a hero. A humiliated man becomes a warning. But the most chilling examples come from rulers who combined creativity with cruelty. These kings didn't want ordinary punishments. They wanted punishments no one had ever seen before, rituals so unusual, so strange that they would be talked about for centuries. Their goal wasn't justice, it was myth-making. One such story involves an Anatolian king known for his obsession with symbolism. He believed that the worst thing you could take from a person was not their life, but their identity. So he invented a ritual punishment where enemies were forced to perform acts that contradicted their public persona. Warriors were made to act cowardly, priests were forced into actions considered impure, scholars were made to behave foolishly. The point wasn't physical pain, it was the destruction of the one thing every human holds precious, the image of who they are. In the Middle East, there are accounts of rulers who used elaborate psychological theater as punishment. Captured nobles were placed on elevated platforms and mocked by performers, forced to listen as actors reenacted their failures in exaggerated, humiliating ways. In some royal courts, punishment took the form of elaborate costumes, wigs, and masks that the condemned had to wear during public ceremonies. These weren't random decorations, they were symbolic. A traitor might be dressed as a jester. A corrupt minister would be made to wear symbols of greed or foolishness. These punishments were meant to turn the person into a caricature of their own sins, a living warning to anyone else who might try the same act. And perhaps the most dramatic examples come from Eastern European and Eurasian steppe rulers. These kings believed that humiliation in front of one's warriors was the ultimate punishment. A defeated general wasn't just killed, he was made to kneel before his own men, confess his failures, and acknowledge the superior brilliance of the enemy king. For a warrior culture built on honor, this was worse than any physical suffering. Some accounts say that generals begged for execution rather than live with the shame. The intention behind all of these punishments becomes clearer when we look at the psychology of kingship. Being a king was one of the most stressful jobs in the world. Rulers constantly feared betrayal, foreign enemies, internal rivals, ambitious generals, jealous cousins. Every day brought new threats. So kings developed punishment systems to protect themselves, not just through violence, but through fear. A king who terrified his enemies had a longer life expectancy. Fear was a form of political stability, and the more creative the punishment, the more talk it generated, and the more powerful the king became in the minds of his enemies. As time passed, punishments evolved. In medieval Europe, kings learned that public humiliation could be more effective than execution. Stocks, pillories, symbolic shaming rituals, these became tools of monarchy. But some kings went further. They designed punishments that reversed social order. A noble who betrayed the crown could be made to serve peasants food, sweep public squares, or perform labor normally done by commoners. The message was simple. Before the king, all men are equal, and I decide your rank. It was a reminder that titles came from the crown, and the crown could take them away. The Ottoman Empire also had a reputation for ceremonial punishments. Sultans used grand public choreographies to send messages. When a high-ranking official betrayed the ruler, the punishment often involved stripping him of every symbol of office, robes, turban, medallions, in front of the court. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It was part of a political theater designed to show that loyalty was everything. Losing the Sultan's trust meant losing everything else. Meanwhile, in Africa, several kingdoms used symbolic degradation as punishment. In some societies, an enemy king captured in battle wasn't killed. Instead, he was forced to acknowledge the superiority of the conqueror, sometimes through rituals involving gestures of submission. This wasn't an act of mercy, it was a powerful political tool. By turning a rival king into a humbled figure, the victorious ruler demonstrated dominance not only over individuals, but over entire nations. The Americas have similar examples. In certain Mesoamerican societies, conquered rulers were sometimes kept alive and forced to participate in ceremonies glorifying the victors. Their humiliation served as a permanent reminder of defeat, a living trophy of conquest. The punishment wasn't designed to end a life, but to break a spirit. At this point, you might wonder, why were kings so obsessed with designing punishments that attack dignity instead of the body? The answer lies in the concept of legacy. Pain is temporary, fear fades, but humiliation lasts generations. A king who punished an enemy so cleverly that people still talked about it years later gained a form of immortality. Even after his death, his reputation lived on. And for rulers like these, reputation was everything. But as civilizations became more interconnected, these punishments began influencing each other. Techniques, rituals, and symbolic gestures spread across trade routes. A humiliation ritual from Persia might appear centuries later in India. A ceremonial punishment in Central Asia might resurface in medieval Europe in modified form. Kings borrowed from other kings the same way generals borrowed battlefield tactics. Over time, the punishments became more complex, more theatrical, and more psychologically targeted. One common theme that appears repeatedly across cultures is the use of costumes, masks, or props. Kings understood that forcing someone to wear clothing that contradicted their identity was deeply damaging to their dignity. Scholars dressed as fools, warriors dressed in childish clothes, nobles dressed in servant attire. These punishments weren't physically violent, but they destroyed a person's social identity, and in societies where honor meant everything, losing that identity was worse than anything else. Another common theme is forced performance. Kings learned that making an enemy act out something humiliating was one of the most powerful tools of punishment. It could be reciting a confession, performing a dance, reenacting a failure, or praising the conqueror. In each case, the goal was to force the person to actively participate in their own humiliation. This created a psychological wound deeper than any physical injury. But some kings took this to the next level. They built entire ceremonies around punishment, ceremonies that looked almost like festivals. Crowds gathered, musicians played, actors performed, and at the center of it all was the condemned person. These events weren't just punishments, they were propaganda. They reinforced loyalty, strengthened fear, and reminded everyone of the king's absolute power. The king didn't just rule through laws, he ruled through spectacle. Stories from Central Asia describe rulers who staged elaborate parades showcasing their defeated enemies. Sometimes the punished person would be placed inside symbolic structures, cages shaped like animals, platforms shaped like mountains, or decorated vehicles representing their fall. These weren't instruments of torture, they were instruments of humiliation, each carefully designed to tell a story. This is what happens to those who defy the king. In some cases, the punishments were reversed. Instead of humiliating enemies, kings humiliated themselves, symbolically, to show divine humility. But when kings demanded their enemies participate in such rituals, the humiliation doubled. Imagine being forced to stand beside a king while pretending to be equal, knowing that everyone else recognized the performance as fake. It was a psychological twist designed to intensify the humiliation. What's truly fascinating is how modern historians study these punishments. Archaeologists find carvings or writings describing them. Anthropologists analyze the rituals. Psychologists explain how these punishments targeted shame, identity, and social status. And in many cases, the findings are more disturbing than the punishments themselves, because they reveal that the kings knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the human psyche, they understood fear, and they weaponized dignity. As time went on and empires grew more bureaucratic, punishments became standardized. But in the early days, punishments were deeply personal. Kings had the freedom to invent anything, and in that freedom, we see the darkest corners of human imagination. Not the imagination of ordinary people, but the imagination of rulers who believed themselves chosen by the gods, superior to mankind, entitled to reshape society through fear. Some kings became infamous for inventing new punishments every few years. Chroniclers wrote that these rulers treated their courts like laboratories of domination, constantly testing which methods produced the greatest obedience. A few records even describe rulers competing with neighboring kings, each trying to outdo the other in creating the most memorable punishments. But behind all the creativity and spectacle, one truth remained constant. These punishments were always about power. A king who ruled through love ruled a fragile kingdom, but a king who ruled through fear, humiliation, and psychological domination held power that lasted even when his armies weakened. His punishments became part of his legend, and legends are hard to erase. In the end, the most chilling thing about these kings isn't the punishments they invented. It's the fact that they believed these punishments were necessary. They believed they were protecting their empires. They believed they were preventing rebellion. They believed that fear was the only way to maintain order. And perhaps in a world without police forces, without courts, without modern governments, they weren't entirely wrong. But their methods reveal a darker side of human leadership, a side that shows how far people will go when given absolute power. These kings didn't just rule nations, they ruled people's identities, reputations, and dignity, and that is why their stories survive. Because while armies and palaces crumble, stories of humiliation last forever. The kings who invented punishments for their enemies weren't just tyrants, they were storytellers. Storytellers who wrote their tales in the lives and reputations of other human beings. Tales meant to outlive them. Tales meant to echo across centuries. And they succeeded, because today, thousands of years later, we still remember them. Not for their achievements, not for their wisdom, but for the unforgettable punishments they invented. Punishments designed not to harm the body, but to haunt the soul.